Today we're talking about Baby Reindeer, which Kate suggested we watch.
Okay, whoa.
You want to talk about why you wanted us to watch this?
Oh my gosh. Now I feel put on the spot. So I thought it was a very well written and compelling story, and I felt that it would spark an important conversation.
Okay. Yeah, no, I can definitely agree with that. Specifically, I would say I love the commentary this is making on the artist's need for public approval, even if it means potentially endangering themselves. And I think that that's an important conversation for artists to have.
So when you say like public approval, what do you mean by that?
I just mean like the approval of the audience,
Oh, okay, got you. Got you.
the approval of every audience that they happen to have.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes total sense.
Hey, so today we're going to be discussing episode 1 through 3. We can briefly touch on episode 4 just to set the stage, but we don't have to delve into it today. We'll be covering 4 through 7 in a different episode.
Correct.
What thoughts do you have on episode 1, Kate?
Well, Hiva. So episode one, I thought that the episode did a really good job of kind of introducing the audience to the stakes right away. I mean, the first scene of that episode is where he's in the police station and he's kind of describing his experience over the past, I think, 6 months. And so I thought that was a very well written way to introduce the audience to the situation and to understand the stakes of the situation.
Yeah, no, I love how time works in this narrative. I love that we get so much like back and forth in terms of time that really helps tell the story in a way that makes it easier for us to understand the character's motivations.
Yeah, and I think that like the commentary over the scenes is also really helpful in that respect in terms of like tracking the time and understanding like what place and time we are at that particular moment.
Yeah, my favorite quote from the first episode was when he meets her for the first time and they're having their like first conversation, and she says, "Some people run away by packing their bags, others run away by standing in one place too long."
Yes, yeah. Wow. What a thoughtful like insight that was.
Yeah, I felt like it really helps set the stage moving forward.
Yeah, I think it really helps set the stage. I also think it added a lot of, I mean, and he speaks to this in that before that quote is introduced of like it adds depth to Martha's character and helps us understand her more as a person. I mean, I know she's not a character. I know she's based on somebody who really existed. And so yeah, that did a lot in terms of not only understanding her character, but his character as well.
Absolutely.
I think the scene that stood out the most to me is just when Martha is introduced because, and I think he's spoken to this already in like interviews and things like that, but he, he said that he didn't want, like, he wanted to acknowledge and kind of reveal like the mistakes that he made, and he didn't want it to be just like a one-sided kind of story. Like he wanted to kind of reveal like the maybe missteps or mistakes that he had made in terms of like interacting with her. And I think that there's a couple of moments throughout the first 3 episodes where we see that play out, like specifically like I think it's in the first episode where he like agrees to go on a picnic with her and how that like brings her hopes up that maybe there's something more happening there. And so I think it's very admirable that he chose to like include those mistakes or those missteps that he felt like he had made.
That's really interesting. So did he say that in a interview?
Yeah.
Okay. A somewhat related point that I wanted to comment on that was so surprising to me and Joaquin, given our unease and everything we know up to that point about Martha being a stalker, was when he followed her home.
Yeah.
Because in that scene, it really seemed, I don't know, like the music got creepy. We saw them both like splitting. It really seemed like she might follow him home, but then he turned around and like followed her instead. And I thought that was a really interesting choice, narratively speaking. I like how that subverted our expectations. And I also liked how it showed how sometimes when people are perceived to be odd or unusual in some way, people are less likely to see them as victims. Like in that moment, I guess technically Martha could have been the victim of his stalking, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point of the show is like, I mean, I think part of the point of the show is, you know, that there's not like that it's supposed to explore our motivations and the motivations from both from both of the characters. And yeah, I mean, I think in that scene we see that he's like he makes this choice because he's interested in her as a person, but he is the one that follows her home. She doesn't follow him home in that moment. And I think another thing that kind of was interesting to me from like a cinematic point of view is that the scene right before that, when they're in the coffee shop, is a scene that's very well lit. And we can very clearly see both of them. It happens during the day. And then we have this very dark scene right after that where he's following her home. And so it's a way to show how time is passing. It's a way to show, you know, how far she maybe lives from that coffee shop and that she walked a long way to get there. But it also reveals something about his character as well.
Yes. Let's talk about that first performance that we see. It's such a powerful moment when he's performing and she interjects and they have that back and forth. You can really tell that he's having this realization that she might actually be useful to him because it's like the audience is finally responding for maybe the first time ever for him, as far as we know.
Yeah.
And we really see that in the way he looks around at his props on the floor before hitting accept on the friend request at the end of the episode. I also appreciated how that helped to like tell us what was going on inside his head.
What do you mean by what was going on inside his head?
Like, you know, in the very last scene in the episode when he's on the computer and he finds out all that stuff about her when he looks her up,
Mm-hmm.
she just sent him a friend request. And he's like freaking out because he's just discovered all this stuff about her. He's seen that she is a known stalker who has been to jail for it. And then we see him like turn around and look at his props on the floor of his house. And we see him do that right before he hits accept on the friend request.
Got it. Yep.
So I feel like including those props right then really helps drive home the idea that he's had this realization that she might actually be useful to him as an artist.
Yeah. How much do we want to delve into like the performance? I feel like there's a little bit more to unpack there. I mean, we see like very at the beginning of the performance, she's kind of like, you know, she's like laughing, right? And then he kind of like brings her into it by, you know, commenting like, how did you get here? Did you fly in on your spaceship? And I feel like that speaks a little bit to what you were saying in terms of like, you know, he's getting a reaction from the audience that maybe he hadn't gotten before in terms of people are laughing now and people are like kind of joining in on the joke, but is it at her expense?
Yeah, I don't think he cares.
So I think maybe that speaks to again like him kind of acknowledging that yeah, I didn't always make good choices. Like I made mistakes, right? Things that you know were not right, that were wrong in that moment.
Mhm.
All right, episode 2.
I love that they added another girl to contrast Martha, or for us to compare Martha to. I also love that the very first moment we meet her, she brings up the possibility of him being a murderer.
Oh, when they're in the bar?
Yeah.
Yes. I think that it's an interesting contrast to see like him versus like he doesn't want to reveal any personal information, right? And then we have Martha who reveals like everything. And so they're two very contrasting characters.
I can't remember which character says this or what the context is, but there's a quote I wrote down that I thought was powerful. Love is most comforting when it's felt one way. Do you remember that quote?
Yes, I do remember that.
Can you tell us about the context?
I'm pretty sure it's Carrie that says it. And she's saying it to Donnie, which is the character's name. And I think she's saying it because didn't he reveal to her that like what Martha was doing? And she was like trying to kind of explain to him, like maybe you haven't reported her because she's giving you something, like she's giving you attention or something that you feel like you need in this moment.
Yeah, you're right.
And I think that speaks to what you were saying earlier of like him thinking about like when he was on stage, how can he use Martha to get people laughing?
Yeah, I think Terry is such a great character to bring in at this point because she really helps answer a lot of questions that I feel like we as the viewers have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think she's providing that kind of outside perspective to the situation that allows both the audience to feel like, yes, I was thinking the same thing, or I wanted to ask him the same thing, while also like forcing the character in the show to confront those things. But I do think we should talk about the ways in which Martha's stalking and harassment escalates in this episode. She friends him on Facebook and comments on all of his pictures. She continues sending emails, and it really starts to affect his mental health and the ways that he moves through the world. And one of the quotes from this episode that really stood out to me was, if you aren't living a life worth living, then can someone ruin it at all? And that was a really heartbreaking quote because it tells the audience that it doesn't feel like he's living a life worth living.
It's also really interesting that they made Terry a therapist. If I'm being honest, I did not realize she was a therapist, but a lot of what she says makes sense now.
I can't remember, was this episode 2 or episode 3 where he reveals to Terry that he's like made up his entire online profile?
I think episode 3.
Okay, all right. So we'll get to that.
Yeah, because I think episode 2 ends with him leaving the train, which is such a
Right.
cool scene when he just like walks backward off the train.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very emotionally devastating scene because, he's finally met this person that he really likes. And, he just decides, nope, I'm not, I'm just going to leave. And then we can just see like the look of devastation on Terry's face. And, she tries to call him, he doesn't answer. But I think, like, in terms of just like filming that scene, I think that was a really good way to show him leaving her in a visual way versus like him saying something to her, right? Or there being like some kind of dialogue there.
Absolutely.
And I think it echoes like what has been previously kind of stated or explained about his character, that he has trouble communicating certain things. Later on, we find out the reason for that, but in this moment, we aren't quite sure yet.
My favorite line in episode 3 is when Keeley says,
You love drama, anything to take you away from the stasis that is your own life. And then he says, It's great to see you putting that psychology postgrad to good use after all this time. And I just love that he's surrounded by these like professionals that are calling him out.
Yeah, and he just does not seem like he's in that place to be able to hear that or take it in, unfortunately.
I can't remember if this is episode 2 or 3, but I love the scene on the bed with Keeley that shows their relationship stagnating. I like how it foreshadows the backstory that we get in episode 4 without like telling us what's happening. Did you want to say something about his fake profile?
Yeah, so in that scene, Terry like really calls him out on what he's done. And I think it's a moment where he kind of needs to be called out on what he's done. And I think it was a good way to kind of show that, especially from Terry's perspective, since she is a therapist. And I think that was a good way to kind of confront his character for not only the mistakes that he was making with Terry, but also with Martha as well.
It's really interesting how they paired him confessing his fake profile to Terry in the same episode that Martha used a false name to gain entry to his house.
Yeah, exactly. That whole confrontation allows the audience to kind of see the similarities between their two characters, although they are very different. There is, and I think, there is this like desire to either kind of hide or to make up certain things so that the truth doesn't have to be faced in that moment. And I think in Martha's character's case, she tends to kind of cover up the truth by what it seems like making up a lot of things about her life, that she's worked with all of these famous people, that, she has all of their phone numbers. And in his case, he's providing less detail, but he's still making up this separate life, right? Like the separate profile.
And it's because he's afraid of being judged by people.
Yeah. Yeah. It's because he's afraid of being judged by people. Exactly.
Which I don't think is her motivation.
So what do we think her motivation is?
Man, that's an interesting question because it really gets at like the heart of her character. And we have to like, I don't know, do we have to keep in mind that she's a real person? Because I feel like this is so well written and so carefully presented that I forget that these are like actual people.
So, I mean, I think it is important to keep in mind that she's an actual person, because it does, I mean, the whole show presents itself. The first thing we see when it opens is this is a true story, right?
Yeah.
And so it definitely wants the audience to know that these are real people and that this is something that actually happened. So I think it is important to keep in mind that she is an actual person, he's an actual person. All the people in the show are real people.
Then I don't know if we should conjecture about like mental illness and how that might be driving some of the things she does.
Well, I think that I don't think it's right to like conjecture about that. And it doesn't really, I mean, the show doesn't seem to want us to, as audience members, to like conjecture about her mental health either.
Right, but we were questioning what her motivation is.
Well, I think I said that because, you said, he's afraid of being judged.
Yeah,
I think that we could still say that Martha's afraid of being judged too, right?
that's true. We could.
Just in a different way than he is. And that could maybe be what drives some of the things that she says.
Actually, it's really interesting how that gets back at the quote that I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, where Keeley said, "You love drama, anything to take you away from the stasis of your life." Isn't that what Martha does too?
I mean, we definitely see Martha ostensibly making up these stories, right, about her life, making up these people that she knows. We definitely see her kind of definitely wanting him to like her in certain ways, and her kind of making decisions that she feels like will bring them closer together, even if it's not maybe the most healthy thing to do in that moment. But what do you think? How do you think she likes drama?
Well, it's just the fact that she pretends that her life is more exciting than it is.
Yeah.
It's less about the loving drama and more about like anything to take you away from the stasis of your life. Like her life is objectively very boring. Like all she does is sit at the bus stop for hours on end, but she
Well,
maintains an image of like having this exciting life where she interacts with all these famous people.
Yeah. But I do think it's important to kind of remember that this is all from his perspective, right? And so we don't know what she was doing all of the time. Like, we don't know what her life was like outside of his perspective of her.
That's true, but we get a pretty substantial view of it just based on how she starts acting once she meets him and once that relationship develops.
Yeah.
Particularly in this episode where we see her at the bus stop constantly, just like waiting on him. What did you think about his performance in the semifinals?
Okay, so this is where like Martha shows up, right? And
Yeah.
she like, yeah, she like completely like she screams at him, she heckles him. And I mean, the show is kind of just done at that point. I mean, she pretty much completely ruins his set.
Yeah, and I think it's such an interesting narrative choice to make it so that Terry forgives him after she sees what he goes through with Martha. Even though before that, Terry is like dead set on not enjoying the show and like not forgiving him, not giving him a second chance. But after seeing what he goes through with Martha, she's like, she seems to have no issues resuming their relationship.
Well, I think it's kind of a interesting echo of like one of the first scenes in the show where he says, I felt sorry for Martha, right? That's why I started talking to her, is I felt sorry for her. And now we kind of see somebody else feeling sorry for him in this moment. And that this was like, this was a semifinals, this was a big deal to him. It gets completely ruined. And now kind of Terry feels sorry for him. And so that kind of leads her to forgive him. But then that is also, I mean, then we get the scene where Martha comes into the bar and starts punching Terry.
Yeah, such a horrifying scene.
It's such a horrifying scene. And I think that it is a scene where unfortunately we see the damage that Martha can do to a person. And I think it's a moment where we start to feel a lot less sympathy for her.
For sure. And I think narratively, it does a good job of setting the stage for episode 4,
What do you mean by that?
for the heightened emotions in
Oh,
episode 4.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a scene which shows the escalation. And I think it does that throughout the episode where we get the escalation of Martha heckling him at his set. We get the escalation of Martha chasing the two of them. And then finally, we get the escalation of Martha physically abusing Terry. So I think another kind of interesting moment is when Martha shows up to the cooking class and says that her name is Sheila. And there's that moment where I forget his girlfriend's mom's name, but it's like later in the night and he calls her Martha and his girlfriend's mom's like, is like, or ex-girlfriend's mom is like, no, her name is Sheila. Like, what are you talking about? And I think it's another example of he does not want to tell anyone like what is happening to him in terms of, Martha stalking him, harassing him. It's another like moment where he just cannot reveal that information. And we kind of see that slip happening where he calls her Martha and the mom is just so confused. She's like, what are you talking about? And I think the show does an excellent job of kind of exploring all the different motivations behind that choice and does it in a way that the audience really can understand what led to that decision.
What choice exactly?
To not tell anyone what's happening to him with Martha.
Okay. Yeah, for sure. And we're not getting into episode 4 today, but I did want to mention that I really like how we get backstory in episode 4 because I felt like it really helped drive home his motivation for keeping Martha and Like it was providing interesting context for that decision.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anything else?
I do want to bring up this quote that Terry says when she's confronting him about why he made up a fake identity. And she says, like, something to the effect of, were you doing this just as like a joke? And in terms of Donnie's character, we have seen him making Martha a joke, right? We've seen him using her to making her the butt of the joke at the comedy set, right? So we do see like instances where he does use people to make a joke, right? And I think that was also, even though Terry did not see him do that, she was not at that comedy set. I think she did bring up a really important point by bringing that up. Like this idea that are you just stating me as a joke, And I think that it's a moment where the audience, because they have seen him using other people as like the butt of a joke, we've also, we've thought about his character from that perspective.
That's an interesting critique.
What do you mean?
Like I'm not sure that I see him as using Terry as a joke. I think with his relationship with Terry, he's addressing some intrinsic hangups that he has, specifically anti-trans hangups. I don't think he sees her as a joke. I think he's struggling with what it means to be in this relationship.
Yeah, no, I think he's definitely struggling with absolutely. Like, I think he's definitely struggling there. But I do think that in the past, like, we've seen him using other people as the butt of a joke. Like when he's like, making fun of Martha in front of the whole crowd.
Do we ever see him taking Martha seriously? I'm not sure that we do.
What do you mean?
Like, I think their relationship, I don't even know if we can call it a relationship because it's so one-sided. The whole time, it's really just Martha obsessed with him and him just like leveraging that interest for his own gain, but also kind of being disgusted by her.
But I think that like at the comedy set, we see him like she comes to the comedy set, she's like laughing at his jokes, right? And I'm trying to remember like how the scene played out exactly, but we saw him like she was just laughing, right? Like she was just laughing at his jokes. And he kind of brings her into the set and says like, "Did you fly in here on your spaceship? What does your like where is your home planet? What does your spaceship look like?" Like, yeah, I think that's a moment where it does seem like he's kind of using her as a joke right there.
Mhm.
And I don't think he sees like dating Terry as a joke or anything, but I do think that Terry like kind of pointed out a flaw in his character. It's just that it's a flaw in his character in other ways. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, you can just cut that if it's not.
No, it's deeply interesting from a narrative standpoint that she accuses him of treating their relationship like a joke. And especially because he's a comedian, right? And I think it's probably right after he tells Terry that he's a comedian that she says that.
I think Terry brings up an interesting ethical question. What responsibility do we have to the people we are writing about in terms of how we portray them and in terms of how we talk about our experiences with them?
Let's talk about craft in these episodes.
I love how each of them ends on a cliffhanger so far and how the intensity, like the emotional intensity increases in a very like clear arc for each episode. Like every single final scene is very intense.
Yeah, I mean I would definitely agree with that. I think the structure of the episodes is very well thought out.
And that's probably part of why I've had a hard time finishing episode 4. I love how the first episode ends with him accepting Martha's friend request, because it's kind of like his acknowledgement that he's letting her into his life. Like he's giving her that permission to have that access. Like I just find that to be an interesting narrative move.
I mean, I think that like narratively speaking, well, I mean, at this point, she's already been emailing him like a bunch, right? And so in order to kind of, I think like in terms of craft, like it was a way to show like how that harassment and that stalking was happening in different ways, right? Like she found his website, she started emailing him, she found his Facebook, asked to friend him, and then started commenting on all of his pictures. And so it was kind of a way to show how that harassment and stalking escalated and was also happening through different platforms. And so, I mean, you know, this is a true story. Doesn't he say that he like thought about unfriending her but didn't? Or did he end up unfriending her?
Actually, I think at the beginning of episode 3, he says he blocked her on Facebook, but at the end of episode 1, he's just accepted her friend request. So they're presumably friends throughout all of episode 2
Got it.
until she attacks him at the end of episode 2. Anything else? We've been introduced to a lot of characters at this point. I'm excited to see if they'll recur later. Characters like, I really like Terry. I hope she comes back and becomes like a central part of the show. I like the mom, Keely's mom. I like Keely, but yeah.
I will say that like I think Keely's mom, it's hard. I mean, it's hard because this show already like has so much going on, but like we only know a little bit about Keely's mom, and I just wish that we knew a little bit more about her. But, you know, there's already so much going on in the show. I understand that, you know, you can only fit so much in, but I do wish we knew a little bit more about her.
Yeah. I appreciated the insight into like that whole family, like how Keely's brother died.
Yeah. I do think it's really important to mention that the creator, Richard Gadd, has said that he doesn't want anyone like trying to find out the identities of these people. And he's asked the audience not to try to find out the real identities of the characters in this show.